Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Jamie Fraser. I'm the curator for the Ancient Levant and Anatolia here at the British Museum. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this special event. This event, as I'm sure you all know, is in celebration of a current exhibition we have in our Asahi Shimbun display in room 3, the room immediately on your right as you come into the British Museum. And that exhibition is called Shattered Glass of Beirut. And that exhibition is the culmination of a long project over the last year and a half, couple of years, that had its start on the 4th of August in 2020, when the port explosion occurred in the port of Beirut, devastating the city. And at the Archaeological Museum at the American University of Beirut, which you'll hear throughout this evening called AUB, it pushed over a single case containing ancient glass vessels, smashing 72 of these on the stone floor. What you're going to hear tonight is the story of those vessels, but it's more than that. It's the story of collaboration between the British Museum and our wonderful, wonderful colleagues at the Archaeological Museum at the AUB, and the remarkable work and blood, sweat, and tears that has gone into reconstructing just 8 of those vessels that you can now see on display. The format of this evening is this. I will shortly introduce Dr. Nadine Panayot. Nadine is the curator at the Archaeological Museum at AUB, and she will give you the background of the explosion and the AUB Museum itself. We'll then pass over to a conservator at the British Museum, Duygu Camurcuoglu. I'm sorry, Duygu, I always mispronounce your name. And Duygu will talk about the conservation aspect of these vessels. You will have plenty of opportunities to type in questions that you might have throughout the various presentations. We will then answer those at the end of the presentations, all in one hit rather than speaker by speaker. And just to be very clear from the outset, before we go any further, I must mention a trigger warning. And the following presentations will contain discussion and depictions of the ammonium nitrate explosion at the port of Beirut on the 4th of August 2020, and of course its devastating aftermath. It is a real pleasure to introduce a collaborator and really now a very warm friend, Dr. Nadine Panayot. Nadine is curator of the Archaeological Museum and associate professor of practice at the American University of Beirut. She holds a doctorate in archaeology, classical Mediterranean civilizations from the Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne University. And Nadine previously worked at the University of Lebanon as a lecturer on ancient civilizations, as director of the Research Department of Archaeology and Museology, as the founder and chairperson of the Department of Museum Studies and Cultural Heritage Management, and as the curator of the Ethnographic Museum. Our association with Nadine started the day after that port explosion, when, at the instigation of the British Museum's director, Hartwig Fischer, another colleague and myself called Nadine and asked her, what can we do to help? Nadine, I will turn over to you.
Thank you, Jamie. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And really, thank you for inviting me to share with you a story about our museum in Beirut. I'll begin by introducing you to the American University of Beirut Archaeological Museum and how and why it grew against all odds in a turbulent region. Then I'll tell you the story of these 8 no longer shattered glass vessels, which, despite their insignificance, reflect the story of human commitment, perseverance, and solidarity. Next slide, please. So the AUB Archaeological Museum is actually the 3rd oldest regional museum in the Near East, after Cairo and Constantinople. The collection grew around a nucleus consisting of 135 Cypriot artifacts donated in 1865 by the American Council in Cyprus, General Chesnola, to the Syrian Protestant College, as it was called before it turned into the American University of Beirut. After that first donation, it continued to expand steadily from several gifts and donations. Later, and before World War I, curators were finally given the means to gradually add new acquisitions. Next slide, please. So what you see on the screen is Post Hall, which was built in 1902 as a science building, which featured a variety of collections, including natural sciences, geology, and archaeology. Like most university museums, the primary purpose was educational and pedagogical. In other words, the larger the collection was, the more diverse it was, the better it was for teaching students and demonstrating real-life examples. Next slide, please. However, acquisition processes changed, of course, with the early 20th century and with evolving scientific methodologies. In the mid-1950s, Director Baramki introduced archaeological excavations as a mandatory internship for all archaeology students at AUB. He started the excavations at Tel el-Ghassil, a site in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, and later wrote, "The museum will grow more from artifacts coming from such excavations rather than from other sources, and the scientific value of the collection will thus be greatly enhanced." End of quote. Next slide, please. Later, Professor Baramki also pioneered a novel practice of exchanging relics with other museums. He wished to supplement the UB collection and fill out the chronological and regional gaps. What you see on the screen is a perfect example of Mesopotamian pottery shards dating from 7000 to 4000 BC that were exchanged in the 1950s between the Museum of Iraq and the UB Museum. The UB contributed flint tools from the Ksar A'il site, an important prehistoric site for understanding Lebanese and Middle Eastern prehistory, ranging from the Middle Paleolithic to the Epipaleolithic. These excavations were conducted by a team from Boston College between 1937 and 1948, and they actually revealed 23 meters of occupational deposits. In other words, plenty of material which allowed him to conduct or to initiate such an exchange of material. Next slide, please. When my predecessor, Dr. Layla Badr, was appointed in the mid-1970s, she had the heavy task of bringing life into the museum. So despite the ongoing Lebanese war, she created the Society of the Friends of the AUB Museum and developed public programming with monthly lectures, exhibitions, children's programs, and educational trips. Next slide, please. But she also had her share of survival stories in the 1980s with the direct shelling of the campus and museum. Next slide, please. The assassination as well of the president of the AUB, Malcolm Kerr, as he was walking out of the museum, and the car bomb that destroyed the administration building, College Hall, in March 1991, and it was not too far from the museum building. Next slide, please. Nevertheless, in June 2006, in collaboration with the Society of the Friends of the Museum and with the support of the Joukowsky Family Foundation, Badr undertook the renovation of the museum, extending the explanation and illustrations of its displays and expanding its exhibition space. Next slide, please. So this is how spotless the museum looked when she resigned in the summer of 2020. Little did we know that Beirut would soon turn into a crime scene, staging the most powerful non-nuclear explosion in history. Little did we know that Lebanon would be going through its worst financial crisis since its creation. And little did we know that the world would be bending over a grueling pandemic and that we would reach peaks of total shutdown. Next slide, please. So, in other words, this was my baptism of fire that kickstarted my tenure as curator at the AUB Archaeological Museum on September 1st, 2020. The building had suffered architectural damage, 5 doors, 17 large windows, but more importantly, the museum had lost one large case containing 74 archaeological glass artifacts that actually constitute a priceless loss. However, prior to taking on my position, and a couple of days after the explosion, my phone rang, and Dr. Zeina Klink-Hoppe, curator of the Modern Middle East at the British Museum, was on the line, offering help and assistance and conveying the message of the British Museum's director, Dr. Hartwig Fisher. There was hope, and conversations started with the British Museum. Meanwhile, I put together a first aid rescue team with my ex-students who had earned a master's degree in museum studies and cultural heritage management, and we volunteered to help all the damaged museums in Beirut. Finally, for the AEB Museum, we made a preliminary assessment of necessary material and shared it with the Institut National du Patrimoine in Paris. Then I organized 2 recovery missions, one for the AEB Museum focused on glass restoration and another for the Sursuk Museum focused on paper. These were the only 2 museums that had actually suffered losses to their collections. The other had mostly damages in their structures and architecture in their buildings. Both recovery missions were financed by the International Alliance for the Protection of Heritage that we better know as ALIPH. Next slide, please. So the first mission, Claire Cuyobert, the glass expert from the ENP, arrived in Beirut on September 4, which means 4 days after I took on my position, and started the recovery and conservation phase with the help of the museum team, the first aid rescue team, and archaeology students from all over Lebanon. Following that first rescue recovery mission, the condition report revealed that 2 small goblets had survived the disaster, and only 15 items could be restorable. However, many remain unrestorable, despite the fact that their entire body shard, or almost the entire body shards, had been recovered and their identity established through our inventory and records. Next slide, please. In partnership with the ENP, we organized a second mission, also funded by ALIPH, that took place in June and July 2021. And it saw hundreds of glass fragments pieced back together and 10 glass vessels fully restored by the ENP experts and the AEB Museum team with the support of archaeology students, which led to the design of a new field course in partnership with the Department of History and Archaeology. So, building on the puzzle work and identifying and matching broken shards from each vessel and having identified those subjects that were suitable for shipment, we planned the third conservation phase with the British Museum. Next slide, please. Can you please run? Now what you will see is actually after the French team had finished their restoration, I needed to thank them in my own way, and what you will watch is a movie about this first phase of restoration. These artifacts used to tell stories of banquets during the Roman period. They told stories of music, poetry, and theater being recited, and beauty celebrated. They told stories of human genius through education and culture. They survived civilizations who used them with respect. They survived earthquakes, tsunamis, and wars for over 2,000 years, recounting our roots and origins. Until August 4, 2020, when they were all gone, shattered in thousands of pieces like our hearts and souls. But a year later, we bring them back to life again. What seemed like an impossible task was made possible with hard work, perseverance, dedication, and above all, teamwork. Breathless, exhausted, and crippled, they stand tall again, heads high, to tell new stories.
They will tell stories of the deceased, the injured, the orphans, the homeless. They will tell a story of greed, ignorance, arrogance, corruption, and cynicism. They will bear witness to the guilt of the culprits of this atrocity, and they will keep telling that story for another 2,000 years if necessary. You see, we still can't mourn, nor forget, nor forgive until such a date. But they will also tell our stories, the story of our resistance to betrayal, to the manipulation of the Lebanese children, women, and men, making them believe that the demons were outside when they had always been lurking amongst us, our rebellion against the internal ailments gnawing and eating away our country. The story of our determination to uphold education, culture, and heritage as the main assets of the Lebanese people, to consider knowledge as the only sacred duty of growing generations, and schools and universities as the ideal places to foster such spirit. Our right to dignity, to live freely, to live fully, to live without being used as seeds of hatred and mistrust. The story of our unwavering commitment to take a leap of faith beyond hate, fear, and despair, and start a journey of commitment, perseverance, and repair, one broken piece at a time.
So after, I'm sorry, I usually get emotional when I watch this movie. So we started an interdisciplinary project, several interdisciplinary projects actually, with different faculties at AUB in order to give these shattered fragments a chance to serve science as well. In partnership with the Digital Cultural Heritage Center at AUB's Faculty of Engineering and Architecture, we focused on developing virtual 3D reconstructions of select broken glass vessels, and these eventually led to 3D prints of the original pieces, granting them a clone. Next slide, please. A collaborative work between the AUB Department of Physics and the Science and Technology and Archaeology Research Center at the Cyprus Institute and the British Museum Science Lab is actually conducting an analysis of the chemical composition of the fragments originating from the shattered glass objects. Next slide, please. These various initiatives materialized in January 2022 with the organization of an international workshop entitled Through Shattered Glass. The goal of this workshop was to assert that the Archaeological Museum at AUB, at least its recent leadership, aims to collaborate with multiple working groups across AUB and beyond, offering material culture for assessment, analysis, and publication with the clear objective of preserving, conserving, restoring, and disseminating the value of cultural heritage. Next slide, please. Communication, however, generated further communication, and with it came a completely unexpected fifth mission when scholar Stephen Koob, who had recently retired as chief conservator from the Corning Museum of Glass in New York, volunteered his time and expertise, and together with Claire, restored 6 broken glass artifacts at the AUB Museum, taught an intensive hands-on course on glass conservation, and participated in person at the workshop. Next slide, please. We took advantage of the international workshop and the presence of Claire and Steven on campus to organize a children's program event entitled Glass Through the Ages. Next slide, please. Last but not least, after initiating contact, the British Museum pursued conversations for over 18 months, then offered to ship 8 vessels suitable for transportation to be restored at the British Museum laboratories. The fragments were carefully packed by Klink-Hoppe from the French Institut National du Patrimoine. The British Museum also graciously invited Aimé Bourzic, AUB Museum assistant, to the British Museum for 3 months of training, which brought the total of restored vessels to 26 out of 72, which were completely shattered. Next slide, please. Before I turn the presentation to Duygu, I would like to add that the 8 glass vessels have been fully restored, as Jamie mentioned, and are now on display in room 3 at the British Museum, before returning to Beirut in January 2023. The exhibition has been co-curated by curators James Fraser and Zeina Klink-Hoppe, and I'm truly honored to have contributed though remotely, to this enlightening experience working with the brilliant British Museum team. Next slide, please. So all in all, when AUB offered me this position, I never imagined this dramatic turn of events would take place, not only for the AUB Museum, but for the entire country. As a first reaction, I could not think of a more challenging time to start curating this prestigious museum. Today, I believe this was a chance to take a leap of faith beyond hate, fear, and despair, and start a journey of commitment, perseverance, and repair, one broken piece at a time. And I thank you all for your attention.
Nadine, thank you so much for that extraordinary presentation. And I think every single person listening would have recognized in that very first day of work where you turned up at the museum for the first time as director to have had that astonishingly mixed up assemblage of shattered materials as perhaps being one of the most difficult first days of work that anyone would have to do in the history of the world. Thank you for that. We really appreciate it. We'll now turn to the actual conservation of the 8 glass vessels that came to London. And for that, I invite Dr. Duygu Camurcuoglu. And Duygu, when you speak, can you please introduce yourself by saying your name yourself to speak for this aspect of the presentations. Duygu is the Art Scholars Senior Inorganics Conservator at the British Museum. Most recently, she became the lead conservator on the Beirut Glass Project, which is an international collaboration between the British Museum and the AUB. And Duygu was also part of the team that won ICON's Nigel Williams Prize in 2019, a very prestigious award. Previously, she was the head conservator for the renowned Neolithic site of Çatalhöyük in Turkey, supporting the archaeological work to have the site gain World Heritage Site status. Duygu, over to you.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening from different parts of the world. Now, thank you very much, Nadine, for telling us the story in Beirut. And now we continue with the story, with the conservation and collaboration story in London at the British Museum. So the objects, the 8 glass vessels, objects that's chosen by Conservator Klink-Hoppe and the AUB team, very well packed, arrived at the British Museum in December 2021. And I was there that day waiting for the objects to arrive. Once the objects arrived, I immediately started opening all the boxes. I was amazed by the intricate packing of each fragment, and this resulted the glass fragments to travel to London very safely. There were no fresh damage at all through transportation. Thanks so much to TFAP Museum Restoration Fund. Shortly after the arrival of the vessels, we put together a post, specific project conservation post for the project. And following interviews, Klink-Hoppe, the same conservator, actually did the recovery of the glass vessels in Beirut, was successful and joined us as part of the Beirut Glass Conservation Team in March 2022. And as you can see, our conservation team consisted myself, Klink-Hoppe as the practical glass conservator, and Burisk again as our as the museum assistant from the AUB, and also our researcher and the team member, and also Loretta Hogan, senior ceramics glass conservator at the British Museum. So our first responsibility, of course, to individually opening each box once Claire arrived and started her position, taking all the fragments out and laying them on the large tables, because the puzzle work which Claire and Ahmed started in Beirut had to continue to make sure that none of the fragments were missed out before we started the reconstruction of the 8 glass vessels. So the initial steps included looking at each individual fragments, photography, before conservation photography of all the fragments belonging to each vessel. As I said, additional puzzle work and all the documentation, as well as discussions with Claire and myself, deciding the kind of the conservation plan, which included that we divided each, the glass vessels into 3 categories: category 1, category 2, and category 3, in relation to their difficulty of reconstruction and the number of fragments they had. So now you can see the objects, the first 4 before conservation, after they were photographed, as you can see. And the other 4 vessels, again, before conservation photography. And here you can see the actual room that we started the project for 3 months, from end of March till the beginning of July. Emma, myself, and Claire worked very, very closely every day. Emma supported Claire with the puzzle work, with all the documentation related to the glass vessels and the research into both the vessels from Beirut and also the glass objects, similar glass objects from the British Museum collections. Me and Claire talked every day and decided what type of conservation materials to use for the reconstruction, and for any gap fills that we needed to do at the end of the reconstruction process. Because it's very important ethically to use the most suitable materials for the long-term safekeeping of these objects in Beirut. And luckily we had, as you see, we had a very large space to lay out all the objects and fragments in the room. You can see some images of Claire conserving, reconstructing the glass objects. We had 2 dishes, one of them quite large, one of them quite small, one small amphoricot, one pitcher, glass pitcher, one very, very tiny cup, and also one like Islamic bottle, which I will be talking about in a minute. And like I said, at every stage of the conservation process, we discussed it with our curator colleagues, both with Nadine, Jamie, and Zeina, about the level of conservation we wanted to carry out, and all the materials and the techniques that would be suitable for these objects. When it came to kind of aesthetical issues, aesthetical perspectives, as a team, we decided that our aim was not to create aesthetically beautifully perfect objects, but we wanted to give as much as support as possible for the glass objects and their reconstruction, but at the same time, we did not want to hide the scars. The new scars appear on the vessels, because now what happened in Beirut, the event, and the resulting damage is part of their important and significant history. Now I want to show you a little video about the reconstruction of one of the vessels. Of course, the conservation work Claire is carrying out here wasn't this fast, but we time-lapsed the video so you can see the construction process in a very short time on one of the vessels. As a conservator, you have to be extremely organized, and you have to have the required experience to conserve very challenging objects like these, specifically glass objects. Again, here you can see Claire's work reconstructing one of the small dishes, small plates. And it's all about, it's really like a puzzle work, finding each individual fragment, making sure that the surface of each individual fragment is clean and also stabilized against any type of damage that happened during or after the explosion. And then using the right sort of adhesive, conservation adhesive, to adhere the fragments together with really with a lot of care, because when glass breaks, we call it springing. So the tensions within glass matrix changes. So sometimes it's extremely difficult to be able to create very flush, very neat joints between the glass fragments. So in this case, Claire worked extremely carefully, and kind of by looking at each fragment and making sure that each joint was good as it could be possible. As I said, we continuously evaluated the process and discussed what we can do best for these vessels. Here is an example. Once the reconstruction process is being completed, for each vessel, we looked at the number of areas that are missing, number of fragments that are missing, and whether we need to support those areas or not. In this particular case, this glass cup is tiny, very small, and we decided to use the same material called Paraloid B72. It's an acrylic adhesive, acrylic resin, and we have used it to reconstruct, to adhere the glass fragments together. And Claire has used the same resin in a sheet form to create gap fills like this, as you can see. And we tinted the fills very, very lightly so that the visitors, people who look at these objects, can still identify what is original and what isn't. And then after that, she placed the fill inside the gap by activating it with a little bit of acetone. It's like magic, really, but it worked really, really well. Of course, our conservation work did not only consist of the actual conservation processes, but also we collaborated with our colleagues from the Scientific Research Department at the British Museum, as well as at the University College London Institute of Archaeology. So here you can see our discussions with the colleagues, scientist colleagues from both institutions. At the British Museum, our colleagues use techniques such as X-ray, micro X-ray fluorescence, and also scanning electron microscopy to analyze the elemental composition of the glass fragments, which were now available to us, sadly, after the explosion and damage. So they could try to see if they could connect the nature of glass, the glass materials used, to specific locations, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean. And also they looked at the, how these materials, where these materials were come from, and how these vessels were produced and where they were produced. They also found some indication of glass recycling, which will be explained more in the actual scientific reports, which will be published soon. At the Institute of Archaeology, our colleagues have used a technique called laser ablation inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, and they were able to analyze each glass fragment by looking at the major and minor trace element levels. So imagine like the minor, the tiniest elements of the glass fragment. Again, this method was used as a kind of comparative study, or kind of to support the study which was carried out at the British Museum, to make sure that the results, the scientific results, were actually consistent. So as a result, and this is the analysis carried out at UCL in the mentioned equipment. So I just want to very briefly mention about this particular object to you. This is the Islamic bottle. We realized that this bottle particularly came from the Islamic era because our scientists, via scientific research, find out that a specific technique called silver staining, a luster technique, was used on this glass bottle, which were actually first started being used in the Islamic period between the 7th to 9th century AD in Egypt and Syria. The technique involved mixing silver and copper pigments with possibly an organic binder and applying it on the glass surface, and then placing it in a kiln, firing it very, very lightly to get rid of all the kind of binder residues, and ending up with like carbon deposits on the surface. And after cleaning these carbon deposits, you would end up with this kind of yellow ochre and like ambery looking decorative surface, which you see on this Islamic vessel here. So by scientific analysis, firstly, we realized that this object was dated to the Islamic period due to the manufacturing and the decorating technique was used, but also its elemental composition showed that the object was probably produced in Syria, and most specifically in Raqqa. So this is, I think, an amazing discovery, because before this study, we didn't know this information about this particular object. During our project, director of the British Museum, Dr. Hartwig Fischer, also came to visit us. He was extremely impressed and excited about the conservation of these glass objects. And he asked us many questions about the conservation process, about the research going on the vessels, as well as the display that we were at that time preparing at the room 3 at the British Museum. So we were very happy to have him visit us during our project. Of course, we didn't, as I said, only deal with the conservation of these 8 glass vessels. We also did a lot of visits from different professionals or public. We also, you know, did a film, created a social media film for you. At the moment, you can watch it on all social media channels of the British Museum and the AUB Archaeological Museum. We did also a lot of interviews with various interested press explaining our project, also as part of lots of talks for national and international colleagues. And here, after conservation images of these beautiful 8 glass vessels. And as Jamie and Nadine said, the Asahi Shimbun displaced shattered glass of Beirut is now still in the room 3 of the British Museum until the 23rd of October. We are so happy, emotional, and proud of this project and the collaborative work. As Jamie mentioned, this project, apart from bringing us all together and actually bringing all these objects together, making them alive again, also made us make new friends, enabled us to make new friends internationally. We also had loads of media interest, press interest, and you can see some of these links on this slide. Now there's a lot of information out there in relation to Beirut Glass project and how everything worked during the project, how this collaborative project worked. So we only hope after this point that this collaboration hopefully will continue and we would be able to, make the remaining 46 objects alive again in the near future. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Duygu. I was lucky enough to be able to drop into the room in which the conservation was being done at the British Museum every so often over the course of the 3 months. And it was magic walking in and seeing Emma and Claire and Duygu. And every time I would walk in, a different vessel would be slowly forming around the edges and becoming manifest again. And the excitement of those 3 conservators was just infectious. And it was just a real privilege to be able to walk in that room sometimes. And thank you so much for opening that door to everyone this evening. Now, we've got some time for questions. So if you have got a burning question out there and want our 2 wonderful speakers to answer it, type that in the chat and I will ask them on your behalf. For example, somebody who hasn't put their name down, but that's okay, says, and this one will be to you, I suspect, Duygu, it looks as though the restoration work was done without wearing gloves. Was this to make handling easier?
Absolutely, great question. Yes, because glass is a very fine material, and when we work on glass constructions, we need to be able to feel all the joints and the glass surfaces. So in this particular case, Claire did not use gloves, but we made sure that all surfaces were cleaned again after we handled them. So yeah, it's because we need to feel the joints and those very fine surfaces.
Lovely, thank you. While we're on sort of technical issues of conservation, Duygu, I'll ask you this one as well. And this is on behalf of Judy Pulley. What was used as glue?
As an adhesive, we used an adhesive called Paraloid D72. It's called, its brand name. It is an acrylic polymer. It's an acrylic resin, and it's been tested in conservation field. tested to be safe for the reconstruction of any type of material, really, for metal, glass, ceramics, or some organic objects, even stone objects. And this material, this resin, can also be used as a fill material. And this is what we did for the glass vessels during the project.
Duygu, I might just follow up on that point actually myself. Because of the nature of the puzzle work, there may well be more small shards of glass that were missed the first time within the collected sort of first aid boxes in Beirut. If more shards are discovered or identified belonging to these vessels in the future, is it possible to incorporate them into the vessels, or how does that work on a technical level?
Yes, it definitely will be possible to incorporate those and take out any fills, if there are any fills in their place, because the materials we use in conservation, for example, this paralloid 272 as an adhesive and as a fill material, it's reversible. So we can actually reverse this material by using acetone. And easily, if one day Nadine and her team decide to take these objects apart again, they will be able to do this very, very easily without any damage to the vessels. So yes, if we find new fragments, we can easily incorporate them into the object.
Fabulous. Another question from Naomi Hankerson. Hello, Naomi. She asks, how long did it take? Duygu, I'll pass that to you first to ask about the 8 vessels at the British Museum, and then Nadine, I'll ask you to comment on the length of time for the remaining vessels that were conserved in Beirut itself. So Duygu, the 8 in the museum in London.
So how long did it take 8 vessels to be conserved?
Yeah, let's phrase it like that.
Okay. Well, it took for 3 months in total, and that was actually the amount of time we had to finish the Beirut Glass project, because that was one of the points in the TEPA funding. When I first saw the images of these 8 glass vessels during the pandemic, summer 2020, I gave some time estimation for the conservation of these vessels to support the funding application project. When Claire started her position and actually started working on the vessels, I asked her to keep time that it took her for each individual vessel, because I wanted to compare the both, time estimations and the actual times of taking. Very interestingly, and this does not happen always, Claire sent those hours to me last week, and we looked at the hours. Some of the hours were so close to each other, which is quite unbelievable, really. Of course, some of the hours were quite different, but that's very normal too, because sometimes objects through several challenges and problems to us that we did not expect. So all in all, I think my initial time estimations were quite good, and Claire's work and actual work hours and how she organized her time was also very good. So I'm very happy about that. But yes, we finished the conservation of 8 glass vessels in 3 months.
Fantastic. And so Nadine, I think on my calculations, there should be 18 vessels that your Beirut-based conservators were able to conserve fully so far. Any sort of estimation on the timing for those?
Yeah, well, it's actually 16 vessels, Jamie. First, well, we have 2 phases, as I mentioned. The first phase took 8 months of what we baptized the puzzling work, because this is when you're actually matching the pieces together. So this took a lot of time with a lot of volunteers and students working and a B museum team working together. But then the actual restoration for the first 10 pieces, it took 2 months with 2 full experts of glass restoration working full time. full days. And then for the 6 pieces, it took 3 weeks. 3 weeks for 2 as well expert conservators, which were Stephen Koop and Klink-Hoppe. So 2 months and then 3 weeks for 6 pieces.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. A question from Rania Hafez. Will the glass be repatriated to Lebanon at some point? Nadine, I'm happy to comment on this, but please comment first. Can you answer this one?
Yes, of course they will. I mean, I said it in my presentation. They'll be back home on January 2023. And then, of course, we're planning a very large exhibition for them because they'll be joining their brother-in-arms, which means the other 16 pieces that have been restored at the AUB Museum. So yes, indeed, they will definitely be coming back home.
Fabulous. And just to underscore, when the vessels come to the British Museum, as we bring in objects from other museums into the museum all the time for exhibitions and things like this, these are always done under very tight loan agreements. And so we've got a loan agreement that exists between the British Museum and the AUB Museum, that these are, of course, AUB's cultural property and that they will be returned after a sort of certain set time. And these sorts of agreements are very, very standard between museums all the time. But thank you for the question. It's really interesting. Nadine, this one is for you as well, and it's from Becky Lau. Hello, Becky. What percentage of the glass that was shattered is absolutely unrepairable?
Well, that's a very good question indeed, because as I mentioned earlier, when we just started, we thought that only 15 could be restored. Now we have 26 that are fully restored, reconstructed. So in other words, when all 3 specialists, Duygu, Stephen, and Claire, looked at that same collection and assessed the damage, every time they would think that there is more that we could do. So as of today, we could eventually restore, I would say, another 15 pieces, maybe 20, but the rest is extremely fragmented, so this makes the conservation extremely difficult. This doesn't mean that it is not doable. I think that by now we know that practically the sky is the limit. We could go on and restore every single piece, but it will take more time because every piece that we will start restoring from now on will have less matching pieces, let's say. So there will be a lot of gaps in the vessel at the end, and we will have to fill in those gaps. And that's why the question is, do we want to go through this, or should we just stop at some point in time, depending on our funding, resources, and energy?
Thanks, Nadine. It's a complicated issue, isn't it? Really interesting question. And Nadine, I'll pass this one to you, of course. This is from Beth Juna. Hello, Beth. Nadine, will you communicate to us the responses of the people of Beirut and how, please? I guess we're talking about the profile that this collaboration has had and all your other collaborations on the shattered glass in the museum and how people in Beirut have responded to that.
Well, we've had various responses, to tell you the truth. That's because the people of Beirut are currently still aching and are busy surviving with their basic needs. So they don't have the luxury of caring and looking at a restoration project of ancient glass. That is the truth. We did have an extremely positive response and very supportive and a lot of encouragement from the international community, but much less from the local community. That is to tell you the truth, and we're still facing that to this day. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I believe when we will do or organize that exhibition at the AUB Museum, probably in the spring of 2023, I think people will understand the full scope finally. They will become less critical and more supportive of this international collaboration, and because I think they will finally see where it led to and how important that was. although now it's difficult for them to understand that, but once they will see the end result, I think they will be very supportive.
Thanks, Nadine. And perhaps, Nadine, can you comment just very briefly? I mean, the explosion is one moment, one disaster. Can you just comment briefly on the issues that are facing Lebanon right now, perhaps for those who might not be so familiar with the Middle East?
Facing what? I'm sorry, Jamie, I didn't get
Facing Lebanon.
Oh, well, today we're at the verge of electing a new president. There is a total collapse today in Lebanon, economic collapse, political collapse, social collapse. I don't think Lebanon has I don't think we've been through such a difficult financial crisis to this day. And such an insecure and unstable political situation, although we did go through the war, several wars, to say the least, but we have never felt as insecure as we feel today. That is the situation in Lebanon. So yes, indeed, looking at 8 glass vessels or 26 glass vessels that have basically been destroyed, that have died, and that we're putting a lot of effort in bringing them to life, it just doesn't make sense. It's a bit absurd, and I totally understand that. I can relate to the suffering of the people, but by the same token, we are giving those pieces, those fragmented and restored pieces, the voice. We're giving them the voices of the people and the victims and the deceased. And that's why, to me, as a curator, it makes a whole lot of sense today.
I think that is the perfect note to end on. We've hit 6:30 here in London. My apologies to those who typed up some really interesting questions there. We just don't have time to get to the rest of them. I'd just like to end by reiterating both Nadine and Duygu's invitation to come and see this exhibition if you haven't. I know many of you have, because I've seen you in the room. Even Nadine, when she was visiting on Monday, was speaking to a couple of our very wonderful friends at the museum. Please come and see it. It's at room 3. It's on until the 23rd of October. And that room, the Asahi Shimbun display, is the room immediately on your right as you come in the southern entrance, the main entrance of the British Museum. And you will see some of these videos and the glass vessels displayed and the project explained in its entirety. I think it's a really magical space, and I think it's really an emotional space. And that's very rare and precious for the museum. And I think we're all very proud of that. And please come and share that with us. Also, as Duygu mentioned, we've done quite a lot of social media activity around this project. Most recently, we released a few days ago a 20-minute video about this reconstruction journey these vessels have been on. You can find that through the British Museum's online YouTube channel, as well as the AUB Archaeological Museum's website as well. And I strongly urge you to go and look at that 20 minutes. My mum really liked it, and that's good enough for me. On that note, I think it's a Friday night here in London. I think it's time to wind down the week, and just to say thank you again to Nadine and to Duygu for ending the week on such a positive note for us. This was a story of tragedy, but as Nadine said several times, this is a story of resilience as well. And I think that's quite extraordinary. Thank you both. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.